In the city of Seattle, Native American culture has always been very, very important. Over the last 150 years, waves of newcomers have shaped and reshaped the city, but through it all, descendants of the city's original inhabitants have continued to be vital parts of its multicultural character. This may help explain why, in the early 1900s, Seattle became the home of one of the most extraordinary cross-cultural, multicultural, multimedia adventures of all time. It was a 30-year project involving thousands of photographs, sound recordings, motion pictures, and 20 volumes of text documenting and celebrating the traditional cultures of a wide array of indigenous peoples from across the western U.S. and Canada. It was the result of people from over 100 different tribes working with a man from Seattle named Edward Sheriff Curtis.
I think Edward Curtis recognized that these people that have lived here for thousands of years are being removed. And so he was recording for history, for our sake, my ancestors, what the land looked like, what the people looked like prior to colonization. And so I can go, oh yeah, there's my great, great, great aunt. And I am very grateful for that.
Edward Curtis is a very important person in the history of Seattle. And yet, there are no Curtis museums in Seattle. There are no streets named for him. There are no plaques that I'm aware of. If you ask people on the street, is the name Edward Curtis familiar to you? Most of them say no. But I ask them, have you ever seen any really amazing photographs of Indians? They go, oh, that guy. So Curtis himself has remained in relative obscurity, but that's changing. What with the sesquicentennial in celebration of his 150th birthday, a host of different exhibits, symposia, and collaboration of Indian people and others. People are rediscovering and reclaiming Indian culture and the amazing work of Edward Curtis. All of this is like bringing Curtis back to Seattle.
This year was significant as it would have been Edward Curtis's 150th birth year. I am John Edward Grable. I'm a professional photographer, and Edward Curtis is my great-grandfather.
We are so excited to have the Curtis family back in Seattle. How's that?
For me and for my two sisters and my wife, we've always dreamt about visiting where Curtis' studio was, where he lived, where he worked, his starting place in his magnificent career that he has. So we decided to visit Seattle for that celebration, the 150th year. And there was many places that we were going to visit while we're here that we were very intrigued with and excited to see.
Edward Curtis was born in Whitewater, Wisconsin, February 19th, 1868. At about the age of 16, his family moved to Minnesota. His father, Johnson Curtis, was an itinerant preacher, and he would travel the backwaters of Minnesota. Young Edward would often travel with him.
The father had to travel all around southern Minnesota, and it was there that Curtis learned with his father how to camp outside. And Curtis loved it, and he never forgot it. But then there was a really severe combination of a winter and a drought. So the family knew they had to leave Minnesota. There wasn't much left for them there. So Edward and his father Johnson came out to Oregon in early 1887, and they came up to the Puget Sound area to Sinclair Inlet, which is southwest of what we call Bremerton. There was a little settlement there, which later became known as Gorst. They settled in, they built a cabin, but it really was the wilderness. There was nothing really there other than a lumber camp.
This house here, it's part of my family history. Yeah. And Edward Curtis was here with his dad. They moved here from Minnesota at the late 1800s and built this home all by hand. And he and his dad, once they got it finished, they called for the rest of the family, and the rest of the family joined them.
Johnson invited the rest of his family to come out from Minnesota, and during the time that they were traveling out here, the father came down with pneumonia. The family arrived here, and 3 days later, the father died.
This is my first time to great-great-grandfather Curtis's headstone. And so he died so tragically. I mean, 3 days after the family joins them out here in Sydney, he passes away. So Edward and Aishel are thrust into having to provide for the family. And I'm sure Edward would have fished in this area. The brothers would have dug clams, mussels, and pretty much anything that they could have done. I know they chopped wood. He did that logging job that he falls from a log and injures his back.
Now he has this accident. He slips on, you always see these pictures of these guys out on the logs in the water, and he slips and badly mangles his back. He hurts several of his lower vertebrae. He spends almost a year on his back. And that year in convalescence is what changes him from Edward Curtis, who otherwise would have been a bricklayer or a logger, to Edward Curtis, the masterpiece creator.
So it sounds like Edward Curtis never slept, but if he did, this would have been the space.
Yep.
And another nickname was the man who slept on his breath, because he had an air mattress that he blew up. I'm sure this isn't it, but.
You know, I'm not sure where Edward's or great-gramps' bedroom was, but when he was doing logging and had that bad injury to his back, it's written that he spent a lot of time looking out the windows, observing the change in the light from sunrise to sunset and throughout the day, and just how the light played different effects on everything. And I can't help but think that that wasn't some of the spark and inspiration into his photography that was soon to come.
So he starts to look at the world differently when he's in this year on his back. And another thing happens. He falls in love with a 16-year-old girl. Her name is Clara, and she's bookish where he is not. She's well-versed in Shakespeare and history where he is not. Remember, he's never got beyond the 6th grade. And he falls in love with her, and when he recovers, he decides, I'm done with this. I'm never going to be the destiny that's set for me. I'm going to sail across Puget Sound, which seems like a small deal now, but it was a big deal then, and go to Seattle, this booming big city, and become a photographer.
When the Curtis brothers came to Seattle, you have a lot of things happening that literally changes the face of the Northwest. It's a great time because you're also facing this time of steam engines and trains coming across the country and people flooding the area in a way that was never possible before. And with those people come ideas and innovations and ways of thinking that literally change the landscape of Seattle. This is the time period where they're dredging out and they're moving whole hillsides in Seattle. So there's this whole industrial change. The Curtises land in Seattle right in that moment.
Clara came over with Curtis and they got married in 1892, and Curtis decided that he would become a photographer. Back early on when he was living in St. Paul, Minnesota, he had worked in a photographic studio, and his father, who was a Civil War veteran, brought back a lens, not a camera, and at age 12, Curtis made a camera on his own using this Civil War acquisition. So he already had some interest in photography and decided to buy into a photo studio in Seattle in 1891, then formed his own studio fairly quickly and became Seattle's premier photographer in a very short time frame.
By 1897, he has his own studio on the corner of 4th and University, which becomes the hub or the place for anybody that's anybody to have their society portrait made. And so he quickly garners a reputation as making excellent portraits, and that is what the nouveau riche in Seattle wanted.
tilt your head this way. The head tilt makes it a little more dynamic. It's not just so straight up and down.
The only real business in photography was portrait business. That was the only way people could make money. There wasn't a market for things like landscape photography or nature photography and many of the things that we associate today. Photography was born in 1839, so by the time Curtis got involved with it, it had evolved, but it wasn't anything near like the photography that we know today. It started out with very slow processes on using metal as the base, eventually evolved into a system that lasted for quite a long time, which were glass plates, and these were literally like window glass. A photographer had to go into a darkroom, coat a glass plate with what they called a wet plate material that had to be inserted into large view cameras and then developed pretty much right on the spot. And this was the type of photography that Curtis learned.
This is the kind of camera that Edward Curtis used, and it's very big and it takes a lot of effort to set it up. The negatives are 8 by 10, which is this big, like that. And one of the things about this camera is that you do it like this to focus. You move it back and forth. You can also have what are called swings and tilts. So if you need to go around a corner, this is why they use it for architectural photography. You can actually tilt this to go around a corner. And if you look in it, if you look inside this camera, this is what you will see. Nothing. It's what a camera really was. There's absolutely nothing in there. There's just a shutter on the front and the box. And then the image comes through the shutter and is upside down. So when you see pictures of people with cloth over their head, there's a reason for that, because you have to block out the light so you can see the image.
So I'm going to have you sort of turn this way a little bit more. There you go.
So you have to get used to literally composing upside down and backwards. So when you're getting ready to make your photo, what you do is you take, this is called the negative holder or plate holder, plate when it was glass plate, and then you put this in.
Shutter closed.
So you then take your slide out, you take your cable release then, and you go click. So it's not a fast process. Definitely the person has to participate because they have to keep themselves composed. And some of the people really come through very strongly of their personality. And that means they were there and they were given their essence and their personality to him to make this photo. So the photos really are a collaboration between the sitter and the photographer.
Now, the great technological advance, which is very critical to Edward Curtis, was the shift from the wet plate method to the dry plate. What this meant essentially was manufacturers who would refine the application of light-sensitive materials to the plate. They do this on an industrial basis. And then you, as the photographer, could go out and take an excellent image and take your own sweet time getting to a darkroom. So it still was a clumsy operation, but it greatly simplified the process, and that's what gives us this marvelous photographic record we have of the Klondike and this North American Indian series.
Curtis prospered as a studio photographer, but there was something in him that was unsatisfied. You can only photograph so many up-and-coming young socialites, and he was looking for something more. Maybe some way to make his mark in the world.
Hello.
Hi, Mary Lou. I'm John Grable.
Hi, John. Nice to meet you.
That's my great-gramps photo that he took. Look at that.
Yes. I've had that for a long time. My name is Mary Lou Slaughter, and Princess Angeline is my great-great-great-grandmother. Princess Angeline was Chief Seattle's daughter by his first marriage. She was quite the person in Seattle. She lived in this little shack behind where the Pike Place Market is.
Well, you know, I really don't know who made the cabin for her, but I know she lived there for a long time. And she had a little wood stove in there, and she used to split her own wood, and I do the same thing.
I heard that when Princess Angeline was down on the beach and she was digging clams, this man approached her and said that he wanted to take some photos of her. And I have to laugh because when I was in grade school, there was this picture of her bent over, digging clams in the sand. And for some strange reason, this was in like 2 or 3 different rooms at Manette School where I went to school. And that picture just fascinated me. And I used to sit there and I would like look at it and think, wow, that's really cool. And then I found out that it happened to be my great-great-great-grandma in there, you know, and that kind of made a difference. We learned that it was Edward Curtis, a famous photographer, that took the pictures of my great-great-great-grandmother. When I was a kid and I seen her picture, I thought she was a little scary. But then, you know, when you grow up and you look and think of what she went through, it wasn't easy for Native Americans. It was a hard life.
The people that lived here prior to colonization, we were just hunter-gatherers and had been that way for thousands of years. We relied on the resources of the land, just like deer, just like bear, salmon. Our clothing, pretty much pounded cedar skirts, but really we didn't have a whole lot because of the climate. It's very mild here. So we were basically hunter-gatherers forever and ever and ever, until just recently when everything changed.
In 1851, when the first white settlers landed at Alki Beach, the Duwamish people in Chief Seattle actually helped them to survive because they were ill-prepared. Despite all the help the Duwamish people had given the new settlers, the city government, not too many years later, passed an ordinance that prohibited Indian people from being in Seattle after dark. A strange way to repay a kindness.
When Curtis arrived in Seattle, he would have found that the Duwamish people were no longer living here, that we had been moved out. And that was when Ballast Island was produced right down there on the waterfront, from ships coming up from California. And they unload all these rocks when they get to Seattle. And because my people didn't have a place to live, the small piece of land called Ballast Island was the only place we could live. But even that became too valuable. And so we were kicked off of that. Princess Angeline was allowed to live in Seattle because of Doc Maynard and his wife. And so because she was working for the Maynards, she then qualified to live in Seattle.
They allow Chief Seattle's lone surviving daughter to live here because she was sort of this presence. She sold clams door to door. She carried rocks in her vestments because the little kids would throw rocks at her and she would reach into there and grab a rock and throw them right back at her. She was the, quote, pet of the city, as the New York Post called her. She was on the plates of the china when you would come here. And in 1896, Edward Curtis strolled 2 blocks down from his studio on 2nd Avenue to the flats where Angelina lived. He saw this woman digging clams in the tide flats there, and he sees something of himself in this picture. He knows that she lives on a subsistence life. And that's what he had done before he was Edward Curtis the dandy. So he then starts a discussion with her about being able to take her picture. This is the picture he takes of Princess Angeline. I want to read you a quote from right about the time that he took this picture in one of the Seattle newspapers. The advent of the white men was a pleasant episode in the lives of these savage people. Their arms opened to receive them as superior beings. Now I want to ask you a question. Does that look like her arms are opening to receive them as superior beings? That's the great thing about this picture. The look. She is just staring through your soul. And Curtis said, just as you are. This is just as he wanted her. And one more thing, which he would do throughout the entire life of Edward Curtis. He gave her a silver dollar, which was a fair amount of money back then, to take her picture. He always paid people to take their pictures. And don't forget this, he was a portrait photographer. He wasn't a documentarian, he wasn't a journalist, he was a person who captured faces. So when he spies Angeline, this doesn't quite launch him on the great epic adventure, but it changes him. He's something he thinks he can build a life on.
In 1896, gold was discovered in the Klondike region of Alaska, and that turned Seattle almost overnight into this hub of activity of people wanting to get to Alaska for gold fever.
The Klondike Gold Rush was extremely important to Seattle because Seattle was a major port of embarkation. And it was a great place for people who had a great deal of interest in mining the miners, as the phrase went. Edward Curtis certainly understood the value of photography to recording the Klondike, but he couldn't get away. So why not send Aschel, his younger brother? Aschel isn't married at that time. Aschel has no family responsibilities. Ed's assuming all those.
Aschel heads to Alaska on the steamer Rosalie, and he brings with him all these dry plate negatives, his big camera, and he's going to photograph everybody and everything that he sees. And then he's going to send those photographs back down to Seattle. So he really went full force into this experience. He is up there risking his life. I mean, he's in sub-zero temperatures. He's climbing mountains. He's hanging out with miners in little shacks by little streams, hoping to find some gold. But in those moments, he takes some incredible photographs. There's a photograph of a miner playing solitaire, and it is absolutely stunning.
Aschel took quite a few photographs, and Curtis then took Aschel, his brother's photographs, and published them under his own name. Now, at the time, you have to understand that it was fairly commonplace for photographers who were the owners of studios to publish work that assistants and others had done in their studio. So Curtis didn't think he was doing anything wrong. His brother had a very different opinion of it, and it created this rift that lasted essentially all of their lifetime. Aschel never forgave Curtis for that slight, and he went on to become a fairly well-known photographer in his own right.
Aschel began a career as one of the area's first commercial photographers. He got contracts with a number of industrial companies, whether they were railroads, or the Fruit Growers Association, or the Pacific Navigation Company. He was taking photographs of industry. And of course, Edward goes off in a completely different direction, looking back and saying, what about the people who were here first? What is their story, and can I help tell that story?
That's Gibraltar up there.
Oh.
And that's the Nisqually just to the left of it. And that's the Muir snowfield that's leading up to Camp Muir. Well, it's nice to be here, and to think how easy it was to drive here in 2.5 hours when poor Curtis had to get here by train, wagon train. It was before cars, and he would bring all his equipment up here, and it was just phenomenal. So we're at Paradise, which is where he started heading up the mountain. But in addition to all of Edward's other interests, he was fascinated with Mount Rainier. From Seattle on a clear day, Mount Rainier stands out almost like it's floating in the sky and is just irresistible. Well, Curtis came from Minnesota to the northwest, so he came from the flatlands and would look up at this mountain and thought, I have to get there. He and his brother came here early on and were just attracted to it. Well, they were outdoorsmen and really just wanted to get to Rainier, and they came here time and time again, and it was just a favorite place of theirs, and came here and took all kinds of wonderful photographs.
And we'll take some today.
And we'll take some today. Joe, how much weight's in your pack?
Probably between 40 and 50 pounds.
And Curtis had even larger cameras up here. What do you think they weighed?
Well, they weighed more, but he had horses.
Yeah. So he just happened to be up there in 1897 when the Mazamas, an original mountaineering club from Portland, were up there. And their goal was to get as many people up the mountain as possible. They also wanted to get as many women up the mountain as possible, which was unusual. And Edward somehow or other knew the mountain, and therefore the Mazamas asked him to lead their climb. And the head of the female group was a woman named Ella McBride, who later came to work in the Curtis studio and then went on to become another famous photographer in Seattle in the Great Northwest. And recently there was an exhibit of her works at the Tacoma Art Museum as part of the whole Curtis Sesquicentennial. And then the next year he was here, He heard these voices. So up to the right, you see the gentle mirror snowfield that you go up, and just where that tapers down is the Nisqually Glacier. So those are all huge crevasses where you'd fall 100 or 200 feet into them. And these people had come down you're supposed to come down the snowfield that way. They were coming down the slope, and they were lost now in the fog and the clouds. And he then rescues them, and he doesn't know who they are. And it turns out that there are Byrd Grinnell from the Audubon Society, Clint Merriam from National Geographic, and Gifford Pinchot from the National Forest. And they were here to determine if Mount Rainier should become a national park. That was their job.
And they would have died otherwise.
And they would have died otherwise. So instead of bringing them down, said, come on, let's go on up. And he took them up to Camp Muir. He already had wood there. He built a fire. He fed them, talked to them. So he must have had a lot of personality. And then he brought them back down and said, why don't you come to Seattle to my studio? So he took them all to his studio. They saw what a great photographer he was. They learned more about him and then invited him the next year to go on the Alaska Expedition and then later to photograph Teddy Roosevelt and the whole thing. So this was the spot right up here at the Nisqually Glacier and the Muir Snowfield where he helped them all out and made it all happen. This is where it all started, right here at Mount Rainier. Clint Merriam, who Curtis had rescued on Mount Rainier, went on to introduce Curtis to E.H. Harriman, the famous railroad man, who for vacation decided to take a little trip to Alaska and invited along 80 well-known scientists, including John Muir, to join him with Curtis going along as the photographer. They were going up to identify all the flora and fauna and people of Alaska. Curtis learned many things on the Harriman Expedition. He learned about lithography, and he learned about wax cylinder recordings because Harriman had wax cylinder recorders there to entertain his grandchildren during the trip. But Curtis thought, aha, I can use those to record the Native Americans. And he later did thousands of recordings to document the tribes. He also learned something he didn't want to do. When he saw these explorers taking things from Indian villages, totem poles, carvings, for the museums, without permission of the tribes, and he decided he never wanted to do that. He would capture them instead in photographs and respected them and would pay them to take their pictures. So he learned from the Harriman Expedition so many things and applied those to his entire project. Edward Curtis's job was to run his studio in Seattle, but he kept getting sidetracked and drawn in by the Native Americans who fascinated him. He was inspired, and it changed his whole life. And this is what inspired him. This is where he went and, with Byrd Grinnell and
George Byrd Grinnell is the foremost white authority on the Plains Indians. The reason his name is Byrd is because the natives gave him that name. He would show up on the plains in the spring and then disappear like a bird when the fall came. And he says, you really want to see Indians? All you've got in this Puget Sound region are just pieces. You want to see Native people? Come with me next year. 1900, the dawn of the 20th century. I will make my annual trek to the Sundance in Montana. So Curtis goes with him.
George Byrd Grinnell invited Curtis to come in 1900 to Browning, Montana to see the last Sundance of the Piegan Blackfeet. The United States government had banned Indian religious observance. It had banned powwows, potlatches, sweat lodges, the Sundance. It had banned all of these things by federal law because they were regarded as barbaric and pagan. And this was to be the last Sundance of the Piegan Blackfeet before that tradition died. Grinnell said, take a good look. We're not going to see this kind of thing much longer. It already belongs to the past. Curtis of this moment in 1900 said, neither house nor fence marred the landscape, and the broad undulating prairie stretching away toward the Little Rockies, miles away to the west, was carpeted with teepees. It was at the start of my concerted effort to learn about the plains and to photograph their lives, and I was intensely affected.
This is where the big idea is hatched. He set out, starting in 1900, to do something that no one had done, to shoot every Native American community in North America, people still living somewhat by their original ways. A huge, huge idea, huge undertaking. He doesn't know how long it'll take, doesn't know how much it'll cost. He just knows he's got tons of energy and he wants to do this thing. So he tells Grinnell that that is his life dream now. That is the thing he wants to do. So he embarks on this great adventure at the start of the 20th century, 1900.
Another important person in Curtis's project was Edmund Meany, who was a professor at the University of Washington, who was a history professor but also interested in Indian studies.
Well, this one's really important, especially with the connection to the University of Washington, because of Edmund Meany. And Meany is responsible for bringing Chief Joseph to Seattle. Chief Joseph was the chief of the Nez Perce, who were one of the last remaining tribes that were literally undefeated in combat, but eventually were trapped and surrounded and moved to the Colville Reservation in northern Washington. Meany wanted his students at University of Washington to learn about Native people, so he invited, and in fact paid for, Chief Joseph to come to the university.
Chief Joseph goes to Seattle in 1903. And he also agrees to go to this University of Washington football game. They were then called the Sun Dodgers. They stopped the game to all pay homage to him. And afterward, they asked him what he thought of this game. And he said, "I saw a lot of white men almost fight today. I do not think this is a good thing." This is before we knew about the spinal brain injury problems of the NFL, of course. So he wasn't here to see a football game. He was here to make his case that give the Nez Perce back what had long been theirs. And all he wanted to was, in his dying days, to be able to go back and have a little piece of his homeland where his people had always lived. Afterward, on that Sunday night, he goes to Curtis's studio and he takes 2 pictures of Joseph. And in both cases, Joseph told him in elaborate detail about every single thing he had on, why he wore his earrings, why he wore his hair this way. You had to have killed a man with a knife as opposed to killing someone with a gun. There was different things that go with what he was wearing. So again, people who say, oh, you posed these Indians, Joseph showed up in how he wanted his portrait taken. So everything that Joseph is wearing in this picture is what has meaning to him and has meaning to his people. So Joseph dies within a year, died, as the reservation doctor famously said, of a broken heart. They buried him, but after a year they wanted to rebury him in a proper place, and Joseph's widow asked Curtis to come over and be the one who would dig up Joseph and reinter him in the ground because they were that close.
Well, here he is. And he's next to his image of Teddy Roosevelt. And of all the images taken of Teddy, it's my understanding that Teddy liked this one the best. And Teddy Roosevelt was an important part of the Curtis story. And it started when Curtis's wife, Clara, noticed an ad in the Ladies' Home Journal for a contest for the most beautiful child. And Edward Curtis photographed a local girl here in Seattle, submitted that, and won first prize. Teddy Roosevelt recognized this and wanted to know more about Curtis and invited him out to Sagamore Hill, Teddy's summer home, to take photographs of his children. Teddy then later invited him to come back for his 1905 inauguration, where he was able to photograph Geronimo, who had been invited to Teddy's inauguration. The next thing that happened is Curtis was invited to be the only photographer at Teddy Roosevelt's daughter Alice's wedding, which upset many famous East Coast photographers, but Curtis was the only one allowed to be at the wedding to take pictures. And finally, Teddy wrote both the introduction to Edward Curtis's 20-volume and portfolio set of the North American Indian, and also introduced him to J.P. Morgan to help Curtis fund his project.
In early 1906, Curtis had the opportunity to sit down with J.P. Morgan in his office, and Morgan had this very brusque style. Within a few minutes, he said, "No, not interested, be on your way." And this is again one of those hallmark moments for Curtis where he responded with his tenacity that he had throughout his life. And he said, "Okay, I'll be on my way, but before I do, why don't you just look at a couple of my Indian pictures? I know you like art. you might like these. He brought out portfolios, he showed Morgan these pictures, and within a few minutes, Morgan did something that his staff said he'd almost never done before. He changed his mind, and he agreed to essentially front money for this project for Edward Curtis.
J.P. Morgan said of Edward Curtis, "I like a man who attempts the impossible." And that is exactly what Edward Curtis attempted. For over 30 years of his life, he photographed in over 100 different Indian tribes, traveling from the Mexican border all the way up to the Arctic, over 40,000 photographs, 10,000 sound recordings. He recorded their histories, daily customs, their myths. He was traveling from tribe to tribe, rarely getting home to see family and friends in Seattle. And in the winter, when he was not in the field, he was going back east, traveling on trains. He was meeting with dignitaries, the elite of high society, looking for additional support, selling subscriptions, doing whatever he had to promote and complete this work.
My father and his assistants worked all day. My father spent most of his time taking the pictures and the others interviewing the various Indians. During my time as in vacations in prep school and college, I was chief cook, bottle washer, and everything else you call it. Took a lot of work running our camps, and in that period of time we went through all the Sioux tribes, the Blackfeet, Walla Wallas, and the Flatheads, Nez Perces. And when we went to those tribes, the local Indian agent had been apprised of it, and he sent out word to all of the old Indians to come in and camp at headquarters. And they also were asked to bring in their oldest garbs and such things as that, so that they could be photographed in their original costumes, which were rapidly passing out for the famous and present blue jean.
What he was trying to do is to go back in time. There have been some criticisms of Curtis for dressing up the natives, for supplying wigs and things, but it's because he didn't want to take pictures of them in t-shirts. He hired all these Native American interpreters who helped him, so he wasn't making these things up. He tried his best to get them looking the way they would have 50 years before white man came.
One of the criticisms that has been exaggerated and focused on to excess, I would say, was the whole notion that he went around putting costumes on people. There are a few instances in the photographs where he had one shirt that shows up in maybe about 5 different photographs. There were times when he put a wig on someone because they had their hair cut in a way that was not traditional. But those times are very few when you compare that to the thousands of photographs he took. Most of what you see belonged to the native peoples that he photographed.
During Curtis's time, photography was still struggling to be accepted as an art form. There were still those vestiges of discussions about, well, can it be art when it's made by a machine and the person who's operating the machine just presses buttons? And so artists in Europe invented this style called pictorialism. It was carried to the United States by Alfred Stieglitz. And the idea was to make photographs look like paintings, to imbue them with a sense of artistry, careful composition, special effects with light, and also to have a kind of emotive sense for the visitor to look at it and be moved by it on an emotional level. So when you look at Curtis' photographs in that pictorial style, they do exactly what a great photograph does and really ask you to consider, who is this person?
When people say, oh, you manipulated, blah, 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 it's like, so? It's, you know, you are making the photograph. You're not taking a photo, you are making a photo. And in fact, a lot of people who like Ansel Adams' photos don't realize that his are heavily manipulated. His point of view is that he wanted to show the awesomeness of nature without the influence of humanity on it. So he did a lot of manipulation where he would take things out of the photograph, like wires or the giant LP on the side of a mountain. So in some regard, it's similar to Curtis, because Curtis was trying to portray a time before the people who he photographed lived. He didn't want the 20th century things in there, so he masked those out. It's really kind of ludicrous to criticize him for manipulating them, because that's what photographers do all the time. And he was a photographer who had a particular point of view.
Native Americans were popular subjects. Even before photography, painters and other kind of recorders had come and captured Native people in varying degrees of authenticity. But what emerges as a more popular image in books and magazines and recreations like the Buffalo Bill Wild West shows often emphasized negative aspects like warriors and taking scalps, and these are the kinds of things that Curtis is undoubtedly steeped in and knows about. And while you could make an argument that some of those stereotypes migrate into his photographs, I think he had a unique way of looking at the world and looking at the world of Native Americans that functioned outside those images of popular culture.
Edward Curtis felt that he needed to document the tribes and had a great urgency to do that because he saw them as vanishing. And the reason that he saw that is they were being forced from their habitat. Their children were being taken away, sent to school. Their food sources were being decimated. The buffaloes were being killed. Fish were being taken away. Their hunting grounds were taken away. They were being killed off with smallpox, measles. Up to 95% of tribes were being wiped out. So he thought that there was an urgency and was compelled to document the tribes and try to save as much information as he possibly could about them for all future generations of native and non-natives.
It took me quite a little while before I realized that besides being a great photographer, that Dad was fundamentally a scientist. To write for the North American Indian, it had to be correct. He knew that the work would be of no importance unless it was.
Many people know Native Americans through the photography of Edward S. Curtis, but most people stop with that information. That visual information is very compelling. They're extraordinary portraits. But there's so much more that Curtis found out about Native Americans, and so much that he learned and recorded in the texts of the North American Indian. And it's extraordinary when you put the two together. You realize that this great artistic work that Curtis has done is supported by a huge amount of actual in-the-field research that he and his colleagues did during their long sojourns among Native Americans.
It mentions that the warriors of the inland tribes were furnished canoes by the Nisqually and the Puyallup. So this is a volume that is about your ancestors.
For every Native community that Curtis and his team visited, they recorded histories, they wrote down vocabularies, they wrote down stories, they recorded dances, and this information has turned out to be extremely valuable to historians and to Native people as they look back on their own histories. Many Native communities and nations had mostly oral histories. So what Curtis and his team wrote down existed, especially for many years, in no other place.
And I know you have a water connection.
Edward Curtis, he was kind of a multimedia pioneer at the time. I mean, not only was he making movies, he was doing photographs, he was doing audio recordings. A photograph is great, a movie's great, but until you get the audio behind it, you don't get the whole story.
One of the things that is overlooked quite often are the amazing numbers of sound recordings that Curtis did in the field. Little 2-minute, wax cylinder recordings on an Edison phonograph. He was recording music, he was recording language. He was using that to help create vocabularies and alphabets for different languages.
It's rumored that he did 10,000 recordings of Native Americans. And fortunately, a few of those are preserved. I think it's 286 of the Archives of Traditional Music, which is back at Indiana University. And Seattle Art Museum's recent exhibit was able to set up a listening station where many of these could be heard.
You are recording through the horn, and your sound is vibrating the diaphragm, which is causing this cutter to dig into and cut grooves into the record.
So this he could have used in the field. This
yes.
is probably the type of model that he used.
At the time, this was the best of cutting-edge technology that was available. This was fantastic to be able to take a phonograph in the field, that you would wind a crank, that would tighten the spring, and then that would drive a motor that would allow you to record on a wax-coated cylinder for 2 minutes and 2 minutes only. And then he would play them back for the Indian people who he has recorded, and they were just astonished. And at the time, everybody was astonished. This was an amazing invention to be able to hear sound coming out of a box. Your 2 minutes is up.
So this is his original advertisement for the picture musicale.
Curtis did things on a grand level that were very unique and inventive. One of them was the picture musicale to accompany this lecture that he did using hand-colored lantern slides, accompanied by a live orchestra, talking about these places he had been and these unique and unusual people that he is photographing. And for a lot of people, it would have been the first encounter they would have had with indigenous people.
So they would take the photograph, they would put it on the slide, and they then would hand color these slides. This is a magic lantern projector, which is how they would project the slides. And Curtis went around the nation giving these talks and filled Carnegie Hall with however many thousand people, Carnegie Hall, and mesmerized them with standing ovation when he made this show. For the 150th anniversary, it was decided to enlarge these glass-colored lantern slides that came through the family and hadn't been seen for 100 years, and put them on canvas. There were concerns that they would be blurry, but they were enlarged to 8 by 10, which were perfectly clear, and on up to 3 feet by 4 feet, and they remained clear, which really heralded the magnificent work that Curtis did with large format photographs.
Welcome. Thank you for coming to the work today.
Thank you for having me.
We came today to talk a little bit about Curtis.
Right.
These are props that were made by the Kwakwaka'wakw people, organized by George Hunt, who was working with Curtis and organizing all of the making of the regalia and the things that were used in the film.
As Curtis continued to expand his relationship with photography, he decided to go into the movie industry, and he decides to make a full feature film with Native American actors, which was termed In the Land of the Headhunters. He goes up to North Vancouver Island to the Kwakwaka'wakws and meets George Hunt.
George Hunt was the son of an English trader and a Tlingit woman who was adopted into the Kwakwaka'wakw both by marriage and long presence in the community. In the Land of the Headhunters was a silent feature film that Edward Curtis made with the Kwakwaka'wakw in 1914. So Hunt served in the role more or less of the producer of the film, sometimes directing, and there is a famous photograph of Hunt on the set with a megaphone alongside Curtis. I think that photograph is really interesting because it just shows the extent to which the current reputation that Vancouver has as Hollywood North really started with the Quack 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 in 1914.
So there's actually a register that shows George Hunt paying particular people to make things for the film.
Okay.
So they are very much the same things that people were making for ceremony and for use for many decades, but of course you know about the fact that it was illegal at the time.
Right. The irony of it for me is that Edward Curtis was able to film this, but again, like, it was illegal for George Hunt to be making these things for his own personal ceremony.
Over here are a case of potlatch masks that were not made for a Hollywood production.
Yeah. I think Curtis had a fascination with the Quack 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 because we are a very theatrical people. Our cultures and customs are rooted in the longhouse, in the potlatch system, and our cultural practice has a very unique theatrical quality to it. So I think that's what Edmund Curtis was attracted to.
It's fun to see this big ladle over here. I don't know if you remember, there's a scene from the film where the guys are having like a hooligan oil drinking contest.
Okay.
They're holding up this big ladle and all the grease is running down on them.
Nice.
And I always think this one where the knot's falling out of the bottom always makes me think of that scene because it's kind of like the grease is going everywhere.
Spilling all over the place, yeah.
As with any project that Curtis put his hands to, In the Land of the Headhunters was an extremely ambitious film. Shot on location with an all-indigenous cast, with native music symphonized. Curtis commissioned a score from a New York-based composer, John Bram, who's best known for having worked with Gilbert and Sullivan. He most likely provided Bram with wax cylinder recordings of Quack 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 music, which he then used more or less, probably less, for his writing of the musical score. The film really has at least 3 different kinds of plots laid on top of each other. On the one hand is a Romeo and Juliet love story. On the other is an adventure epic. And then on top of that is laid a documentary aspect where authentic winter ceremonials of the Quack 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 are portrayed as part of the action of the fictional film. The film premiered in the same week in New York and at the Moore Theater here in Seattle, but it did not make very much money.
The film went broke because of an argument with the producer and then disappeared for about 70 years. But Bill Holm from the Burke Museum would hear about this film and kept asking where it was. And he searched and searched and searched, and all of a sudden found it at the Field Museum in Chicago, in the basement.
A copy came into the possession of the Field Museum by way of an eccentric collector in Indiana, who probably got his copy from a friend who would collect old films out of a dumpster. Bill Holm had worked with the Quack 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 community for many years and had been told by elders who had worked with Curtis on the film that he really ought to go out and find a copy of this movie. Holm was thus on a mission. So when he traveled, he would ask people if they knew anything about this movie. Once, when he was asking that question to George Quimby, who was a curator at the Field Museum, he got an affirmative answer.
And I asked him my standard question, and he said, after a pause, "We have a copy."
He and Quimby thus started on a partnership to restore the film, and because of his contacts with the Quack 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 community, Holm was able to create a soundtrack for the film, which adds both authentic documentary sounds, but most importantly it adds Kwakwala language dialogue, appropriate to the action of the film. So in a way, it brings the film straight back to the Quack 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 community, literally giving them a voice in the film.
Curtis spent most of his time in the field and spent much of the winter trying to solicit more funds and subscribers back east. Meanwhile, in Seattle, his wife, his family, and his assistants ran the studio. Adolph Muirs was a man who did amazing work in the editing of these photographs and processing of the plates. Ella McBride became a well-known photographer in her own right and was almost like a second mother to the Curtis children.
Curtis hired some great people, including Imogene Cunningham, who became a famous photographer. She was a chemistry student at the University of Washington, and I like to think that she worked on some of the chemicals that helped produce the silver prints, the platinum prints. These were metals, and I like to think that she had a great deal to do with that.
Curtis also hired a number of Japanese photographers. Among them were Frank Kunishige, who was one of the founding members of the Seattle Camera Club. And I find it very interesting that Curtis had in his studio women and Japanese and people working in his studio that in that time period maybe would have had a difficulty being able to work, and yet he was open to this and clearly respected these people. So while Curtis was out in the field, there were people working away at doing the photographs for the studio, which of course was helping to keep him afloat too. They made photographs of the Rainier Club and the Arctic Club, so they photographed a lot of the well-known people in town. And it was a very successful portrait studio.
So everybody back in Seattle was trying to hold it all together while he was off doing the project. And he would bring back a load of glass plate images, which would then be developed at the Seattle studio and turned into prints. Silver prints, platinum prints, gold tones, and also the best known photogravures that were then printed in the North American Indian. Clara, his wife, was helping run the studio along with daughter Beth, and it was tough on the family. Finances were becoming meager because all the profits were being sent off to fund the project, and it became so difficult that finally Clara filed for divorce in 1916, which I'm sure was very hard for her, and what made it even more difficult is it all showed up in all the newspapers.
Well, here we are in downtown Seattle where so much history has happened, and we're outside the Rainier Club, and the Rainier Club has so much history and memorabilia with Edward Curtis. I can't tell you what room Edward Curtis was a resident in when he was boarding in between his trips, but here's one of our overnight rooms today. And
the Rainier Club played a big part in Edward Curtis's life here in the city throughout the time of his whole project.
The club purchased the land where we're standing right now in 1903 to construct this Kirkland Cutter building.
The Rainier Club is a gentleman's club in Seattle, which still exists today and was founded in 1888. In 1903, Curtis was famous enough in Seattle that he was invited to be a member of the club, and then as things got rougher with his relationship with his wife, he would stay at the Rainier Club whenever he was in town.
They were very good to him. During his divorce, he spent a lot of time here upstairs, and in a lot of his correspondence, he would say, "I'll be where I always am, at the Rainier Club. You can find me there." Why does this place have so many fabulous pictures, including some of the premier masterpieces? It's how he paid his rent. He had nothing. So he would give them his pictures as a way to continue staying here. And he also took some pictures of club members as well.
You know, we really don't know a lot about that time, but we do know through our minutes books and other recordings that Mr. Curtis ran out of money, and the way someone figured out how to pay the bill was through the donation of original signed platinum prints that now adorn the stairwells and the hallways. We all get to enjoy 100 years later every day.
You know, you just walk down the hallways here and they're just all over the place. So you turn any corner, any room, and you'll run into Edward Curtis's, you know, classic, magnificent images.
Yeah, beautiful images.
When Curtis decided to do the project, the North American Indian, he thought it would take 5 years. But in fact, it took 30 years to complete the final volume.
All of this took much longer than Curtis anticipated. World War I came along, that put things almost at a standstill for several years. And then the interest in Native Americans waned after World War I. The country was interested in the future. During the 1920s, he had to scrape by, begging money, taking out loans, doing everything he could to publicize this work entirely on his own dollar. And he wound up accumulating an enormous amount of debt from which he never really recovered. In 1927, Curtis and his daughter Beth set out for Alaska for what would be the last field trip.
His oldest daughter Beth accompanied him, along with his assistant and Harry the Fish, who was the skipper of the Jewel Guard, a boat he purchased so that they could go up to remote islands and places above the Arctic Circle. And they ran into a hellacious storm with huge rolling waves. And it ran them aground hundreds of miles from anywhere. And it was really dicey. For a couple of days, they didn't know if they were going to be able to get off this sandbar. But eventually they did. And Curtis said it was so worth it, because he got to see native people whose civilization had not touched. And he found them to be just wonderfully happy families. And he said to himself that if missionaries ever tried to find their way to these tribes, that he trusted that the sea would do its duty. And it was a great way to bring a conclusion to this work.
After completing his journey to Alaska, he came back by boat, arrived in Seattle, went to King Street Station to jump a train and go back down to California where he was living at that time, and was met by the police, who arrested him for not paying alimony all these years to poor Clara, the wife. Curtis then had to go to court, break down in tears, explaining that he had no money. He couldn't pay alimony because, like many artists, he was broke.
The judge asked Curtis, "How much money have you ever made from all of this work?" And he said, "I haven't personally earned a dime. In fact, I owe more money than I ever earned on this," which was true from all records and information that we have. And the judge said, "Well, if you didn't earn any money, why did you continue doing this work?" And Curtis just said, "It's the only thing I knew how to do. I was duty bound to finish." And by pure coincidence, again, the records that were needed from the previous trial to substantiate this claim of alimony could never be found. Curtis was freed, and he finished his work by 1930.
When the North American Indian was completed, the nation was in the midst of the Great Depression. People had lost interest in things Indian, and the world forgot about Edward Curtis and the North American Indian.
The Morgan family didn't care about this work anymore, and so they sold all of this to Charles Laureate Bookstore in Boston, and Laureate paid $1,000 for this enormous cache of information, including all of Curtis's records, his notes. All of this information and all of this material lay forgotten literally in the basement of this bookstore for 40 years.
So Harriet Leach is a pretty amazing person, and the more I've learned about her, the more impressed I am with her.
Every once in a while, things in history take a turn that you don't expect. And Harriet Leach and her correspondence with Edward S. Curtis is one of those unexpected moments that happen in history. Harriet worked for the public library for many years. She retired and volunteered with the Seattle Historical Society, and she found some photographs, some portfolio photographs of Curtis's in that collection, and she was curious about who this person was.
Nobody knew what these were. They were literally forgotten books at that time. So they asked Harriet Leach to see what she could find out about these books, because they seemed to have some Seattle connection. And bless her soul, this woman spent many months trying to track them down. This was in 1948, and by good fortune found out that Curtis was still alive. He lived in Los Angeles at that time, and she started a series of correspondence with him.
Dear Miss Leach, this is a brief note to let you know I received your letter and to tell you that I will be glad to furnish the needed information. He was really encouraged that someone was writing him and rediscovering his work.
Right, right. And there's one letter in which he says, "Tell all my friends in Seattle, I think I plan to live another 10 years or something." I mean, I think the idea that it was someone from Seattle specifically that was writing to him.
Tell him old man Curtis is still alive.
That's right, that's right. Right.
So, over the last 18 months of his life, Curtis and her exchanged 52 letters. and he tells the story of his life. He's so proud of what he did. So he gets to do what we all want to do. He gets to tell the story of his life to Harriet Leach. He dies in 1952 at the age of 84, having lost everything. Never made a dime off of the North American Indian, but Curtis had achieved his goal. And this is arguably the greatest photographic achievement of all time. Not just the greatest American photographic achievement, but the greatest photographic achievement of all time.
Lois Fleury and I first ran across Curtis material right after 1970. The remainder of the Curtis material had been with a book dealer in Boston. That material was purchased and moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico. Lois and I became extremely interested in his work. When I met Lois, she had a contemporary art gallery in Austin, and I was an art professor at the University of Oklahoma. But when we saw Curtis and his work, it intrigued us to become involved in acquiring and placing his material.
I think what impressed me most with Curtis's work was the spirit and the soul of his works. I think that he viewed the Native Americans in a special way that most other Caucasians did not.
We moved to Seattle area in 1976, and we've been at this location in Seattle since about '81, and we have probably been the only gallery that has exclusively represented Curtis throughout the years. That's one that I've always loved.
Yeah.
We've had people come in from all walks of life and many countries. Some of the people have read the books about Curtis, but I think there's still a tremendous number of people who have never heard of Curtis. But almost everyone that comes in is very intrigued with his work.
There are many books written about Curtis, but probably the most inspiring one is by a famous Seattle author, Tim Egan, who's maybe best known for his regular editorials in the New York Times. And he wrote a book called Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher.
I went all over Indian country while I was doing this book, to all the tribal homelands, and it was a great way to research a book. These are fabulous places, and there's no place I went to where I didn't see prominently displayed in Indian country a Curtis picture.
When Timothy Egan wrote the book about Curtis, we found that we were getting many more requests to see the Curtis material. These are independent researchers, people who have a cultural heritage in a native group, but it's also people who are just interested. The University of Washington Special Collections is the place where all the rare and scarce and valuable material for the libraries as a whole is held. The collection that relates to Edward Curtis is fairly extensive, as well as the first edition of the portfolios and volumes of the North American Indian. We have a lot of supportive material. We have every book that probably anybody has written about Curtis. One of the great advantages of my job is sharing that material with other people. This last June 1st, I will have had my job for 50 years, and the best part of it is to constantly deflate the assumption that Special Collections is a place where you can't touch anything, you can't have fun, you can't enjoy yourself. I'm on a personal mission for the rest of my life, as long as I can stand up, to make that not true.
Yeah, this is such a great letter. I mean, it's just from the president, just says that Mr. Curtis, Mrs. Roosevelt was delighted as I was that with your remarkable Indian picture. My dear sir, how are you able to do such work?
Hello, welcome to the Seattle collection. I'm Ann Ferguson, I'm the curator of the collection. It's nice to see you all, welcome.
The Seattle room is essentially the Seattle collection here in the special collections of the Seattle Public Library. This collection has thousands and thousands of items in it about the history of our community. In terms of Edward Curtis, we do have a fair amount of material. We have 2 complete sets of the North American Indian. One was recently donated to us by Harriet Bullitt, and we're so grateful for that. We have digitized all of the portfolio photographs. Over 700 of them are now available, and I'm happy about that, of course. When we started looking at the calendar and realizing that we could be celebrating his 150th birth anniversary, we started thinking about what that might look like. We started out, it was going to be Edward S. Curtis and the North American Indian. Seems perfectly reasonable for a sesquicentennial, right? And then when we brought Native Americans onto our committee to help us, they were like, well, why is it all about Curtis? Why can't it be about Native Americans? And there's only one answer to that, and that's yes, it can be about Native Americans. That's what the whole body of work is about. And they came up with this idea of beyond the frame. So here's the frame that Curtis created around his subject, his perspective, his point of view. And what we wanted to do was take that, but go beyond that and look at this bigger picture, more inclusive of our entire community.
We strive to look for meaningful ways to connect all people with the rich culture of this region. We are proud to be one of the many organizations who will share the story of Edward Curtis through educating and engaging the public.
Beyond the Frame is an opportunity to step outside of the photograph and inside the real lives of Native peoples. The people who know what it is to be Native, who know what it is to be a survivor, who know what it is to be misunderstood because we've been painted both in history in Curtis's photos and today in mascots and popular culture with one generic brush stroke. More than anything, I believe there's power in Native peoples telling our own stories. I believe our stories are sacred. I believe this is the power of Beyond the Frame.
Welcome to the Seattle Art Museum, and we're excited to see the exhibit on double exposure. Many Seattle organizations came together to discuss how to best represent this anniversary. And it was decided, instead of just telling the Curtis story, which has been shown in other places around the country, it was decided to tell a much bigger story, the Native American Indian story and the relationship between Curtis and Native Americans, as well as vice versa.
Curtis's legacy presents multiple challenges and opportunities. His images have done much to anchor Native peoples in a historic past, creating this fallacy that Native people no longer exist. But his work also helped to transform a humanistic eye into the Native person in their home, which I think at the time was fairly forward-thinking. And so I feel that this exhibit is special because it's changing the narrative on the importance of Curtis in terms of Native identity and history. So this is a great opportunity for Seattle to be forward-thinking and to present the breadth of Native creativity in this region.
Let's go inside and look at these wonderful photographs.
Sounds good.
We're in the part of the museum that has a rotating display, and we're lucky enough this time of year, this year, to be at this display, Deconstructing Curtis Romanticism versus Reality. And this is put together by Lydia Saigo, a tribal member.
There have been multiple exhibits around Seattle for the past year, both bringing back Curtis's work as well as current Native American artists, storytellers, dancers, their regalia, their reactions to Curtis, their positive reactions, their negative reactions, So it's been a great learning experience for me, and I think Seattle and the region did a wonderful job to try to tell everybody's version of the story, not just one side of the story. I think if Edward Curtis could have joined this event, he would have been so pleased to see the Native Americans, that they didn't vanish, and to see them thriving and reviving and doing magnificent artwork just like he did. It would have been a wonderful thing for him.
My name is Jennifer Squally. I am a descendant of Puyallup and Nisqually tribes, and I am a commercial diver and a photographer. I've always liked photography since I was a little girl. So a few years ago, I decided to pursue a career with it. I started attending the Art Institute of Seattle. One of the first classes that I took was history of photography, and Edward Curtis was one of the main people that I was studying. Once I learned more about him, it really inspired me to do similar things with my photography, really try to get a voice to some of the concerns, some of the issues, and some of the things that surround us as a culture and as a people. For the 150th anniversary of Edward Curtis's birth, a group of us decided to go on some adventures and retrace some of the steps that Edward took during his career. A lot of Curtis's passion in his photography was surrounded in water. And that is a huge, huge thing for our tribe, for a lot of the surrounding tribes. So our first filming was the Suquamish canoe journey landing. It's a real special event for the Native communities in the Pacific Northwest. During that filming, I was able to meet Joe Bakanskis. He's a photographer that uses large format, similar to what Curtis used, and to watch Joe carry that and to help Joe carry that really gives me an appreciation for what Curtis went through when he was carrying it across, the nation. It was a really neat experience to be able to film with Joe side by side and really see the differences in how we did things. We were able to have my kids come along and take pictures of the canoe journey as well and teach them a little bit about photography.
Hey, this mountain, kind of the mother of our waters, our glaciers are here, and they feed the rivers that's always provided for our people. Salmon, the wildlife, everything, the entire ecosystem surrounding it. And Curtis, both brothers, spent time up here and were a big part of the mountain.
Curtis spent an enormous amount of time taking pictures on Mount Rainier. So what we were doing was trying to take pictures on Mount Rainier that might remind us of what Curtis had done. Okay. My name is Joseph Bakanskis. I was a software engineer for 25 plus years. I'm retired, wandering around Seattle taking pictures. Mount Rainier doesn't give itself easily to the photographer, but I was able to set up in a couple of different places and try to get something that might be like Curtis might have taken. That was a pretty interesting experience.
Well, Steve, this is going to be exciting because we've seen a lot of Curtis photos, but haven't learned as much as I'd like to about the wax cylinders and all the recordings that he's done. So I've heard there's an amazing collection in this house. So, hi.
Hello.
I'm Bob.
I'm Troy. Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Troy. As part of the sesquicentennial, we decided to learn more about this subject of wax cylinder recorders and found a collector in Seattle, Troy Taylor, who owns Original Edison phonographs and recorders.
It's a very simple mechanism. Basically, it's a clockwork motor. No electricity is required. This is entirely spring-powered.
I just find it very fascinating. This is the thing about the early recordings that really fascinate me, is the idea that we can take these voices, take these sounds, and then transport them in time. And that must have been something pretty special for the people that he was recording.
So Troy brought the recorders to the Art Institute of Seattle to do a recording session where George Montero, a native artist, played into one of these old phonographs and was recorded on a wax cylinder, exactly the way it would have been done 100 years ago.
My Tlingit name is Tainak. Shongukedi means come from the sun. Speaking into the wax recorder actually took me back into the history that Curtis was trying to preserve. And to be a part of it and understanding that Curtis brought this out into indigenous land and did recording, I was very honored.
As I watched this process and I listened, what struck me was just the amazing cooperation that Indian people afforded Edward Curtis to record. Very personal, very sacred songs. And I think George and his grandson Seth appreciated being invited and having the opportunity to share their culture and have it respected and honored and taken down for posterity.
Something that was very important to Curtis was taking pictures of Native Americans in natural environments, to really see everybody in their element.
Well, the falls itself, have you been spending any time down here, Willie?
First time.
Oh, it's on the National Register as one of the most sacred places in the country.
Oh, wow. So one adventure that my kids and my husband got to go on was to get some portraits done at Snoqualmie Falls with Joe and George Montero.
George was able to get permission from the Snoqualmies to go to a place where only natives and their people with permission can go. Oh boy, this is going to be hairy for me. This is a sort of classic descent, if you will, into native territory. We scrambled down about 15 feet of very slippery, rocky stuff. It probably took 15 to 20 minutes just to get down and to get the camera out and get it set up. So the next 2 hours was hard. But, Curtis was doing this all the way, every day. Photographing people from another culture is difficult in ways that you might not realize. It's actually very simple to take pretty trivial but striking pictures of people from a different culture. That actually might not tell very much about the person you're photographing, because in many, many ways, people are all the same. And you want to get the humanity first, and then accentuate those cultural things, maybe, that are different enough for you. Hold that. Good. The important thing about portrait photography is that it's always about a person. If you lose sight of that, you lose sight of everything.
This is a photograph that Joe took up in Snoqualmie Falls. I look at it and I actually traveled back in time several hundred years, perhaps 1,000 years. I look at the past, the present, and the future. It's all captivated in a photograph. So this is all very much like what Curtis did. He left history. So whenever I look at this is no longer George Montero. This is our ancient ones. They speak to us. They guide us. They ask us to teach our young folks what little we know for the future.
My experiences over the last year have been really exciting. I've networked a lot with other photographers, videographers, and other people involved in these Edward Curtis projects. And it really kind of jump-started my career in photography. I was able to start working for our newspapers, for our social media departments in our tribe, and it really just started with that spark of interest from Edward Curtis and the things that he did.
Look at that.
Confident.
Look at it.
Hey.
It's on a pen.
And you just made a little camera too, huh? Almost like all his cameras.
So when I look at my children and I see their future, I really hope that we're able to continue bringing the culture and awareness and understanding to the community and to people to really hold on to what we have and to really help our children understand how important all of these things are. Our lands, our water, our culture, our language, all of those things.
As a result of reintroducing myself to the Curtis work and acquiring an understanding of what my great-grandfather did, I have felt compelled, along with my wife Colleen, to start our own project that we're titling Descendants. Because I'm a descendant of Curtis, and then I'm seeking out descendants of his work. And it's a fascinating project in that I'm finding Native Americans and photographing them in the 21st century, how they want to be photographed. I want you to pick which one that you want to wear, which one means something most to you.
Well, this is my first one.
Okay.
I had the privilege and the honor to meet John Grable and his wife, Colleen. I was really taken back by him, and I don't know what it is, but we just kind of met, and all of a sudden I feel like I've got an old friend. So we took a trip to Seattle, and that was really fun because we hit Seattle just when the sun was going down. We had our pictures taken while we were approaching the city. It's named after my great-great-great-great-grandfather. We got up in the morning and we went to a photo studio that was down kind of in the old section of Seattle. This fella does pictures on glass, and he wound up taking 3 different photos of myself and 3 different photos of Mr. Grable. And then we got our picture taken together. I'm just excited about that because his great-grandfather took the pictures of my great-great-great-grandmother.
I think that if Edward Curtis were alive today and we're able to see some of the things that are happening with the cultures and the tribe and the revitalization, I think he'd be really excited to see that a lot of the things that were being stripped away during his era and his time are starting to come back and starting to really reverse. And we're immersing ourselves in our language and our culture and really bringing it back to a place that was disappearing during his time. So I think that he would be excited to see the things that we're moving forward with.
Today our culture is thriving, and I believe that if Edward Curtis were to come back today to see that renaissance, so to speak, and how we are still here, we have never left, that it would leave with him just an extended period of pride for the work that he did. And I think that when people see that and understand that and know that this is a part of history that he wanted to leave behind for indigenous people, I see it as a gift. I see it as a part that is being passed on. And I think that he would embrace what he sees today.
My predominant feeling when I look at the Edward Curtis photographs are thankfulness. Thankful that he was able to capture at that moment in time a transition, a collision of societies. And I have predominantly a warm feeling when I look at them because I'm looking at people that used to be here. So I would hope that people would look at his pictures and go, oh yeah, there were once people here that looked like this, and that those people are still here today. We are modern Indians, and we carry our traditional ways. And so things are changing. Just a little while ago, when Curtis arrived in Seattle, it was illegal for us to be here. And because of this Beyond the Frame exhibit in 150-year anniversary, it feels okay to be a Native person in Seattle. And so maybe we don't have to hide so much anymore. And so maybe I can talk in my own language. And I could say something, o tigwid sid, Curtis, todagwihiko, yayu sa te hala, stab. Which means, thank you, Curtis, for the work that you put in on these picture things.